can keep doing questions, but we still have a little bit of ground to cover, so we're gonna like tighten it up a little bit, but I love the enthusiasm. I know this is a lot of material, and again, I'm just gonna keep saying this to you, remember, it is not to remember every single fact. It is to know that you've seen most of them, and to start noticing detail, right? Start noticing differences, because that's really, really helpful for everything you do. Okay, so this is especially for my fruit tree people out there, but it's kind of helpful in general to know, is how do buds know when to grow, right? So for so many of our deciduous flowering trees, including our fruit trees, how do those buds know when it's time to start flowering? Like I think we've all seen an ornamental cherry flowering in November, and we're like, oh, honey, not there yet. So the way they know how to do that is by something we call chilling hours. And so this is the number of cold weather a type of plant needs to fulfill the dormancy requirement. So basically that bud forms and it says, I'm dormant until I get a certain number of cold hours. Once I get that number of cold hours, then I start growing. So for cold to really count as cold, ideally we want it somewhere in the like 30 to 40 degree range. That's what a plant thinks of as kind of cold, right? And our area receives 800 to 1,000 chilling hours. And so you can look at maps where, you know, we're kind of down here in this, that's not where we are. We are in this kind of 800 to 1,000 range. You know, further north you need more chilling hours, further south you need fewer chilling hours, right? A plant that has evolved to grow in southern Florida shouldn't want 800 chilling hours to leaf out, right? 200 makes sense. But what that also means is that if you take a plant from southern Florida and a flowering plant and you put it up here in our environment, after 200 chilling hours, it will start leafing out. So it will start leafing out in January, in December. Then those leaves and those flowers come out and it's so cold that they're killed, right? That's really the goal here. The goal for the plant is to leaf out when it doesn't think it's going to get super cold again, right? It wants to leaf out as soon as possible, but when it doesn't think it's going to freeze again. So if you're ordering especially fruit trees online, which is a really great way to get fruit trees, make sure you're looking for something with this 800 to 1,000 chilling hours. If you are picking something with a shorter number of chilling hours, it might start flowering way too early, the flowers get killed, you don't get any fruit. If you start buying things with a very long number of chilling hours, it might never flower, right? Because if you don't hit 1,200, plants like, I'm not going, right? So it's worth knowing kind of that's where we are range-wise. The other thing that's important to think about kind of in general when we're thinking about North Carolina, we are a highly variable state. Highly variable. We're actually right on kind of the edge of a number of different ecoregions, and also if you think about the mountains, mountains to the coast, wildly different, right? So a 1,000 foot elevation gain is like going 200 to 300 miles north. Why do I say that? Because if you go from 0 elevation to 4,000 elevation in some of the highest points in western North Carolina, that's similar to going, right, potentially 1,200 miles north. Why does that matter? Because that wonderful rhododendron, or whatever it was you saw out in the mountains, I don't care if it's all North Carolina, it doesn't know what it's doing down here in the playground, right? The soil is different, the climate, the western part of the state has a much richer soil because it is higher altitude, and so it can hold more organic matter in the soil for kind of climate reasons we'll talk about next week. Down here, you're super sandy, you might have salt issues, you might be warmer. So when we're thinking about a climate that you might be interested in planting from, I would encourage you to think about this, and we'll talk about this in the soils talk more, as a soil and ecotype, or an ecoregion. So this is the Piedmont. You've heard us refer to that before. We're the Piedmont. The Piedmont actually goes further north, and it goes further south, right? I'd be much more interested in planting, if I wanted to plant native plants, I'm thinking about the Piedmont. I'm not thinking about North Carolina. Because Wilmington and Asheville have nothing to do with how I'm growing here. into some of the, some more angiosperm nomenclature. We have monocots, right? So we've talked about these again, right? They emerge with, yeah.
Hey, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Back to talking about, you said buying like a flowering tree or something from Florida and then planting it here. And does the plant ever get it? Does
No.
it just
No.
keeps being in Florida?
No, because that's evolved in. That's like hard genetics, right? That is a hard encoded genetic trait. Plant doesn't get it, the plant dies.
So let me ask this too. So I'm talking about like if I bought like a native dogwood that was, like created or
Yeah.
I'm sorry, in Florida and brought it here, like it's still in like I'm still in Florida.
And that's the worst part, is that plant is actually Cornus Florida. But so this is a thing, and we'll move on past this, but like if I want to plant a native plant, it is actually worth looking for, and you can ask our native plant nurseries, you can ask any nursery this, you can look at this for seed sources. If I want to grow it from a plant or from seed, it's really nice to be looking for plants or seeds that are from local ecotypes, basically, like the locally evolved things, right? So this is something like we have our plant sale committee right now, and we're growing all these native plants. And we would much rather buy seed from somebody who collected it locally and now is doing that than to buy seed from Prairie Moon, which is a great supplier with a bunch of people, but they're seeds from like the Midwest, right? Because those Midwestern plants have Midwestern genetics and they're used to the Midwest. And so even if it's technically the same species, the underlying genetics are just a little bit different. Which is not to say that like if I can't find it locally, I'm not going to order it from Prairie Moon. But if I can find it locally, I'd rather find it locally because the plant will never figure it out. Ever.
I have that cherry tree and I'm like,
yeah, and the problem is that what's going to happen is it's going to flower or leaf out, and especially when it leaves out, if the leaves die because they get frost, it's going to leaf out again. So now it paid twice for one season's leaves, and it's tired. And you do that enough years in a row, and like we all know what happens when you're tired for too long, right? Like you wear yourself out. You wear yourself out.
crash.
Yeah, you crash. Okay, cool. So for angiosperms, for the other major difference between kind of leaves and veination, the real underlying difference with the angiosperms is actually how their vascular tissue is laid out. Or the monocots, right? So the monocots have vascular tissue that's all kind of like, I think of it as just kind of higgledy-piggledy, like you just got bundles thrown in kind of everywhere of xylem and phloem. As opposed to the dicots, which have it very clearly organized in a ring, right? With xylem on the inside, phloem on the outside. These really clear bundles. The reason this matters is because especially when we start thinking about trees, all of this really important vascular tissue gets laid down right around the outer edge of the tree, right under the bark. It's an area we call the cambium. And that's why you can kill a tree, right, by cutting half an inch in all the way around at the base. Because you've cut all this vascular tissue. It's not just arranged kind of wildly throughout, it's just at those outer edges. Right? So it's just helpful. That's kind of why that happens, why it's good to know. Why girdling works, basically. Girdling being that way of killing a tree. So for flowers, this is my major thing that I think is important. They're evolutionarily conserved. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means that for this plant, especially for the flowering plants that really depend on pollinators, they actually try really, really hard to keep their flowers as stable as possible, even as other parts might be evolving. It really matters to them that they don't have too much variation in their flowers. Because if you get too variable, the pollinators can't find you. Or you might not have what they want, right? So it's very important to them that the pollinators can do that. And what's really cool about that is that early botanists were able to figure out the evolutionary relationships of so many of the flowering plants just based on their flowers. And as we go back and we do a bunch of genetic and genomic work and look at the actual DNA sequence, we change things a little bit, but actually a lot of those original relationships that were discovered just by looking at flowers help. Right? So people will get all up in arms where they're like, they just renamed something and I don't know. That's fine, that happens, but actually a tremendous amount of the original naming was right, which is pretty impressive, because it was just like a bunch of mostly guys in the 17 and 1800s, like looking at flowers, right? So the real function of flowers is reproduction, it's seed production. They can only be produced by mature plants, not juvenile plants. When we think about perennials, it's worth noting that plants can move kind of from vegetative to reproduction once they're mature, right? But once you're mature, you can produce flowers. And it can take woody plants several years to get here. Even hellebores, it can take years to get here. So some plants can move from juvenile to reproductive within a single year. Some it will take much longer. Some of the flower parts. This is another one where it's just helpful to know that this exists, right? So the sepals or the calyx are these kind of little green supporting leaves down here. Then you have the petals, all those together are the corolla. The pistil, this is the female part. Charlotte always says, ladies carry pistils. So that's gonna be, the female part is the stigma, style, and ovary right here in the middle. Right, so the stigma, the style is this little stalk here, and then the ovary. And then the stamen is the male parts, and that is going to be the anthers, which are actually the little pollen-containing areas, and the filament, which is the kind of supporting stalk for the anthers. So it's just helpful to know you kind of often have green supporting leaves, then you have petals, and then around the outside you have the male portion with the pollen, and then in the very middle you have the female portion, which is where the ovary is. Flowers can be complete or incomplete in that they can have all of these parts or they can be lacking some of them. For incomplete flowers, what we most commonly, or one of the ways that is very common to be incomplete is to, or let me leave that aside. So they can be complete or incomplete, and then they can also be perfect or imperfect. So perfect has both male and female parts. Imperfect plants are typically, they're lacking either male or female parts, right? So you will have flowers that are just male or just female, right? So they're lacking all of their anthers and like the stamen area, and they're lacking all the stigma area. Does anyone know of a common garden vegetable that has male and female flowers?
Zucchini.
Squash, zucchini, right? So the first flowers that come in, they come in on a really narrow stalk. You get really, really excited. No squash, right? And then the next ones come in on a really thick stalk. And that's actually the ovary, right? That's the structure that's going to give rise to the fruit, right? And that's where you get squash. Monoecious and dioecious really talks about whether if you have male and female flowers, do you have them on one plant, right? Monoecious is one house, dioecious two, right? So we do have plants where sometimes you'll see Yopon holly is a native plant, as an example, that has male and female plants. Ginkgo has male and female plants, right? So you can have a plant like a squash where you have male and female flowers on the same plant, or you can have a plant like a ginkgo where you have a male plant that only produces male flowers and a female plant that only produces female flowers.
So that's dioecious?
Yeah.
So that's when you need more than one of something for them to cross-pollinate?
Yes. Yeah, and just because plants are tricksy, sometimes you need more than one to cross-pollinate because sometimes some plants have an ability to not be pollinated by themselves, even if they have the pollen man. Right? They request someone else's pollen, please. And that's because, a huge part of reproduction is actually crossing genetics, right? So they're trying to ensure that they're getting crossing genetics, so they're not just always kind of just hanging out with themselves, you know?
Quick one.
Yeah.
Flower has all parts. Perfect has both male and female parts. What's the difference for complete and perfect?
You could have so you could have a complete, say your question one more time to make sure I get it right.
What parts are missing for a perfect plant? Otherwise, why isn't it just complete?
Yeah. So perfect has both male and female plants, but you could have a perfect flower that had both male and female, but was lacking the sepals.
Okay.
Right? So complete and incomplete is about sepals, petals, stamen, carpel, right?
not just the sexual.
not just the sexual
organs.
organs. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, aha. Squash. Okay. Yeah, so right, that's that thick stem that's actually gonna become the squash.
So squash is complete? Is it complete?
Squash is
Perfect.
complete but imperfect. Right, because it's got sepals, it's got petals. Oh wait, no, you're right. Ah, this is hard. Okay, so please use me as your cautionary tale. This stuff is complicated. A complete flower is always complete. So squash, thank you for doing this to me, is incomplete. Even though it has sepals and petals, it doesn't have both reproductive parts in each flower. So it's incomplete and imperfect. Yes?
Is it imperfect necessitates it like incomplete?
Yes. If imperfect, then incomplete. If
So that
I don't know, we'll diagram it out. Right? We'll get there. Oh man, botany. Oh. Okay. All right. So pollination. This is really what these flowers are all about. It's the transfer of pollen from the male organs to the female organs, right? Like that's what pollination is. It's necessary for fruit set and seed development, right? You cannot get fruits or seeds without pollination. Not all plants can self-fertilize, like we talked about. There are some things where you're going to need two different varieties or two different plants to get better fertilization. The major methods of wind pollination, actually, really one of the, by far the most common methods of wind pollination, because this is what all the grasses do, and the grasses are basically the biggest group, is wind pollination, right? So you'll see tiny flowers, you'll see catkins, little things, grass flowers, that's all wind pollinated, right? They don't need big showy petals, they're not trying to attract anyone, right? The wind is just gonna carry it out, and they're just gonna produce so much pollen that like some of it will land where it was meant to go, right? Like we've all experienced this with, spring in North Carolina. The other major thing is going to be insects and other animals, right? So we think mostly of insects, but you can get bats, you can get other things doing this sort of pollination. This is where you're typically going to see colorful flowers and fragrance. I don't say good fragrance, I say fragrance, right? By that, I think, if we think about things that are pollinated by beetles and flies, which are actually quite common, that's where we're looking for like the stinkier flowers, right? These are the ones where it might bloom and everyone says it smells like death, right? That's because that's what beetles and flies are into. That's how you attract a beetle or a fly, is typically with a rotten smell. Right, it's more the bees and kind of butterflies to some degree that like that sweeter smell. Another big thing that plants are doing is that while this might be what we see, this is what the insect sees. Insects see in a different range than we do. They don't see far red that well, but they see ultraviolet. And so you can see there's kind of these like little landing pads and there's this kind of stuff. It's fascinating. If you just search online for like UV flowers, right, you'll pull up all these intricate things that come up, and that's because that's what the insects are seeing. So it's cool because this is what we think it looks like, but like the plant doesn't actually, there was no goal to make it this one pink, right? Like they were trying to do this. So for fruits and seeds, and this is really important, only seeds are the product of pollination. What does that mean? That means that for an apple, the fruit, right? That is entirely a product of the parent plant, the mother plant. It is entirely the mother plant's genetics. The seed inside is a combined genetics from the mother and father, like parental plant. This is why everyone, like you probably heard before, if you grow an apple from seed, it's not going to taste like that apple you ate, right? Because the apple you ate that you thought was so tasty was entirely maternal genetics, whereas the seed is maternal and paternal genetics, and it might have different traits. This is why for a lot of plants we like to graft, so we like to cut plants apart and put them back together, and it's because we're trying to make sure we maintain the genetics that we want and we don't cross it, right? So if you eat a tomato that's absolutely delicious, and it was open pollinated in a field, and you plant that seed, it's not necessarily gonna be like the tomato you ate. Could be great, but it's not necessarily gonna be like the tomato you ate. That make sense?
Questions. Why do I hear that with apple you need 2 of them for cross-pollination?
A lot of times you need 2 at the same time, or you need to make sure you have multiple kind of to have enough pollen. I don't know if they strictly can't self-pollinate, but it might also be a case that they don't like their own pollen. So if you have another variety present as well, it pollinates better. So then once you have that pollination, the whole goal for pollination for apples is not actually to get seeds, right? The goal of pollination for apples is to force the plant to make the fruit around the seed, right? Because that's what we actually want. But there's probably some self-incompatibility there, but I'd have to double check, to be honest, too. Yeah. Apples. Alright, we'll check. Okay.
Briefly before we open
Yeah.
on fruit, we read in the text about berries and that certain things like tomatoes, watermelon, things like that are classified as berries because they have a soft outer layer and all the seeds inside. Does that include things that are kind of hard, like squashes and gourds too?
Probably not.
Okay.
Berries, I say that because I would have to look up like what the technical definition of like for a squash and a gourd is too,
Yeah.
because like a lot of what we think of even as pumpkin might be a berry, now that I said that.
It's listed in the text as a berry.
I think watermelon.
Which made me wonder about squashes and other things that are.
But not a strawberry. But not a strawberry.
Sure.
Strawberry is not a berry. This is the kind of stuff I would have count as like fun party trivia, and I wouldn't get too bogged down on it. But if you want to talk about this, just come find me at the break and we'll like sort it out. Okay, I'm gonna pick up the pace a little bit. All right, so leaf types, and this is what we're gonna finish out here. It's really, really important, especially to think about. Of these, I'm going to single out alternate and opposite. Right? If 2 leaves come out like this, they are opposites. They come out
Alternate.
alternate, okay? Remember opposite, alternate, right? This is very important. This is going to be very diagnostic for a lot of plants. Simple and compound, we'll work through some examples in the second session, so we're going to leave that mostly there. But note that there are a lot of leaves out there that are tricky, and they look like a leaf, but what you're actually looking at is multiple leaflets on one stem, okay? We're just gonna start skipping slides. I love all the questions though. Again, okay, so is this alternate or opposite?
Opposites. Alternate.
Awesome. Okay, so some plant classification systems, and then I really want to hit plant physiology because I think that's really important. So we're going to go through this quickly to give us a little bit of time for plant physiology. You will get all the slides, you will get the recording, you will get everything, and the textbook is very thorough. Right, so we think about the major classifications. We have annuals, they live just one season. They can be summer or warm season annuals or winter or cool season annuals. There are a great many plants that we treat like annuals here that are not annuals, but like leave them outside and they're gonna die by the cold. You just annualized it, right? Biennial is gonna be 2 growing seasons. These are not quite as common, but we do run into them. So even like hollyhock is a biennial. A couple of other things are biennials. Perennial is gonna be 3+ growing seasons. They can be kind of 2 major flavors. They can be herbaceous and die back to the roots each year, right? So this will be a lot of your like flowering perennials, like your native plant flowering perennials. Whereas woody is going to be persisting above the ground. You'll see in our exercise in the next section that even though like in the most grandiose of terms, you could call a tree a woody perennial, typically they're thought of as trees, right? Like they're thought of as this like. We're not talking about do you live 3 years or 7 years, we're talking about do you live 150 or 300 years, so we think about them as a little bit separate. So for annuals, it's important to remember that you can have summer annuals and winter annuals. So for a summer annual, I think of these as existing like on a calendar year, right? So they're hanging out typically over the winter as seeds. Sometime in the summer as it starts warming up, they germinate, they go to flower, and they die. Right? And their goal is to get all of this done in 1 year. It's kind of a live fast, die young strategy. right? So in contrast to a winter annual, I think of these as being on a school year instead of a calendar year, right? So typically sometime in September, October, when it starts cooling down actually, they get the signal to germinate, they grow over the winter. You thought your lawn looked great all winter, and then sometime in probably the next month it will explode into weeds that you were sure were not there. They were there the whole time. Flower, and then they actually get killed more by the heat than by the cold. Okay? So we have all sorts of different annuals. Again, winter annuals, summer annuals. This will be especially important when we come back to our weed section. We'll talk about this. But when marigolds, zinnias, pansies, a lot of our vegetables. Actually, a number of our vegetables could survive longer if they were in nicer conditions, but like come November, they all die, right? Because that's kind of what happens when it gets really cold out for a lot of our summer veggies. A biennial is kind of a stretched out annual. So it germinates the first year and it grows as often what we call a basal rosette. That's just a bunch of leaves down at the bottom, real flat. Grows like that for basically a year, and then it's in the second year that it flowers and then it goes to seed. The reason I call this a stretched out annual instead of a short-lived perennial is because this plant does not have, they typically don't have the ability to go back to kind of this vegetative stage, hang out for another year, and then keep going, right? This is vegetative growth, reproductive growth, death, okay? Again, that's kind of like our hollyhocks, other things like that. Foxgloves, mullein, honesty. That's in contrast to a perennial, right, which actually has all sorts of crazy other abilities. So they're going to germinate, and they're going to become reproductive, give out seed, but then actually they're going to persist as roots in this dormant phase, and then they're going to come out and they're going to be kind of vegetative, they're going to go reproductive, they're going to go dormant, they're going to be doing this every year. And the cool thing about this, I always love this diagram because it introduces like space plants, right? Just floating around. That's because oftentimes if you cut up this stem, you can get the plant going even from that stem, right? So you can kind of get it going through seed, oftentimes through stems, through cuttings, through all sorts of different ways, right? And it's because they're gonna live a longer time, and so they have a lot of kind of exit strategies, right? So that's kind of a major way that gardeners think about plants, is these different life cycles. When we're thinking about plant classification and we're talking to clients about plants, it's really helpful to think about scientific names. Why does this matter? Because Vinca and periwinkle, right? These names are kind of interchangeably used for both of these plants. One is a hardy evergreen ground cover, one is a heat-tolerant tender perennial. These are wildly different plants, and so if someone's kind of trying to come up and talk to you about Vinca or periwinkle, it's helpful to know, like, what are you talking about, right? And it can be helpful, if they don't know the scientific name, that's fine, but ask them to describe it to you if you're not sure and you need to narrow it down. Common names are just really not reliable. They vary tremendously by region, by who you're talking to, by background, by everything like that. Fun fact, common names for birds are extremely reliable. The bird people got real serious about that and standardized. Plant people are not there, right? Common names are not reliable.
No names.
Scientific names are just a systematic way to actually refer to these plants and to refer to almost anything. And so you might have learned this kind of in basic biology, but all life is organized this way, where we're typically thinking about it from this level down: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You'll look online, you'll find all sorts of mnemonics for that, for how to remember that if you care. The ones I know are all not terribly appropriate, so I'm not going to share any of them with you. But there's a lot of fun body ways to get an undergrad to remember that. Typically, when we're thinking about plants, we're really thinking about genus and species. Occasionally, we're interested in family. So family might be something like, tomato, pepper, eggplant, potato are all Solanaceae. It's helpful to know that those plants are related based on what they're doing and how they're growing, and also what their pests are. So species is is the main taxonomic unit for grouping organisms, right? So it's family, genus, species, right? So if we think about our dogwood, Cornus florida, Florida is the species. Below that, we'll actually see variety, right? This is something we care about as plant people. A lot of times you want to know, so it's an echinacea, right? It's a cone flower. Echinacea purpurea. It might be the variety powwow white, right? These are what we think of as the plant names, oftentimes. Powwow white would actually be a cultivar. So a variety, and this is important, let me go back and clean up what I just said. A variety would be, I'll use the example that I'm kind of alluding to. Cercis canadensis is our redbud. Cercis canadensis variety alba is a white-leafed redbud that is naturally occurring. You can find it in forests, and we've taken it from forests and we've started breeding it. That's a variety.
White-leaved or white-petaled?
White-leafed. No, white-petaled.
Oh, okay.
That's what happened to me. Introvert talk running around. So, white petaled, exactly right. A cultivar for Cercis canadensis, our red bud, might be something like Ruby Falls, the really dramatic weeping one. That's a cultivated variety, cultivar, right? Cultivated by man, by people. A nativar is kind of a weird term that you might run into sometimes. It's a native cultivar. That is a native plant that we now have a cultivated variety of. Okay, so that would again be that Cercis canadensis. There's no way for me to make a nativar from a non-native plant. A nativar can only be made from a native plant. And finally, we're going to think about a native, which is a plant that lives or grows naturally in a particular region without direct or indirect human involvement. Okay? Remember, when we're thinking about region, we're not thinking about North Carolina. We're thinking about like the Piedmont or some sort of actually ecologically relevant region. Right, so going through this example again, you have Cercis canadensis. It's our redbud. Cercis canadensis variety orbiculata. It's a western redbud. It's a type of canadensis that they find more in the west. Forest pansy is a purple-leaved redbud, right? So that is a nativar. You might also call it a cultivar, but it's a cultivar from a native plant, so that's why we can also call it a nativar. And then finally, Cercis canadensis, variety canadensis, is a pure native species. I'm showing you all of this to know that if you see a species name and then all of a sudden you see stuff start getting written after it, that's okay. Sometimes it tells you what the variety is, sometimes it tells you something more about like the organization of it and where it fits and where it's related to other things. Yeah.
If this is something that needs to be gone over, great, I
No.
understand, but what's the difference between a variety and a subspecies?
Probably how a geneticist is feeling at the time. I think a variety, when I think of like the way that these terms are used colloquially, a variety, that's the kind of term that we as gardeners and horticulturalists would be talking about more. The term subspecies is something that like I would be thinking about more when I was talking about the geneticists or plant systematics people. Like that's just kind of a term that they're gonna be more comfortable with, where they're like, I think you could definitely call orbiculata a subspecies.
Okay.
100%. If you were a plant geneticist, plant systematist, whatever that. If you were a horticulturalist or a home gardener, you might call that a variety.
Okay.
But you're looking at a similar space, but both of them are going to be not human derived.
Okay.
So a hybrid is a cultivar?
Yes. Yeah, and their nomenclature will be totally different. So if you had a hybrid of this, it would be like Cercis X, you wouldn't see canadensis anymore, and then underneath it you would see whatever that name was for that created hybrid.
So if you wanna get the naming right, do you have to put the word like cultivar, like you don't have the word cultivar?
No, this is the way they're actually written.
So how do you know
A
that?
cultivar is denoted by either single or double those things.
Rotation.
But how would I know that was a nativar? You said that was a nativar versus cultivar.
Because you know that Cercis canadensis is a native plant. Yeah, no, it does, no, it's a good question. There's a lot of layers here.
Well, briefly, when we see the species name variety species again,
That's like the most, it's like the
Purist.
yeah, it's like,
The platonic.
yeah, like the platonic ideal, exactly, of Cercis canadensis, right? This is, like, I would describe this as like Cercis canadensis. This is like Cercis canadensis that grows in the western part.
what about the top one then?
Yeah, you're not gonna see this much.
Okay.
Yeah. That's for someone who's like really trying to impress upon you, like how canadensis their Cercis is. Okay, are we okay going like a couple minutes into the break? Because I actually think this is like, as gardeners, this is gonna be the stuff that you're gonna find the most practical, but I'm not gonna try and belabor it too much. The real point I want you to take from this is that plants produce energy through photosynthesis, and they can only produce so much energy. It's like money in a bank account. From that money in your bank account, you can't do everything. You have to make choices. There are trade-offs, right? So for a plant, we're just gonna skip ahead. A plant can use that energy, that money, right, that it gets from photosynthesis for growth and defense. It can use it to save it for the future, right? If you think about like, you want to put a little bit aside because like if you get all your leaves and stems walloped off, maybe you'll need to grow them back. You can invest it, that's future generations, you're gonna put it into seeds and fruit. Or you can give it away, right? And that's kind of probably, plants are selfish, that's not what they wanted to do with their money, right? So that's gonna be a thing like a deer coming along and eating all your leaves, a gardener coming along and eating all your fruit, right? And so they need to balance basically growth and defense, reproduction, seeds and fruits, and having enough in reserves that they can grow back if something really bad happens. And they're always trying to balance these things, right? Again, that energy is made through photosynthesis. Just for like the nerds keeping track at home, this is how that works. It's really, really wildly cool because it's the basis of like all terrestrial food chains. Plants are able to use energy from the sun to create sugars from carbon they like steal out of the air. It's awesome, right? Thank you, plants. As a fun fact, and this is cool, I'll take over. The reason they're able to do that is actually, remember this chart from the beginning? Like there's this weird little thing where the bacteria are getting with the plants. And you're like, what's that about? That is when plant cells took on the specialized interior cell of the chloroplast. That was a bacterial innovation. Photosynthesis was a bacterial innovation that the plants took into their cells and were able to actually basically like adopt from the bacteria, which is really cool. That's how we got mitochondria, we saw that, right? And that's fun. Not all plants can photosynthesize. It's also worth knowing there are plants that are purely parasitic. When we think about like Monotropa uniflora growing off of beech tree roots. So most plants are photosynthetic. There are some wonderful weirdos out there that are not. Yeah. And so this is kind of the real meat and potatoes of why this is hard and why photosynthesis matters and why trying to balance all your needs matters. Is that the way plants take in the gases and everything else they need is through stomata, which are these tiny openings on the undersides of their leaves. And their goal is really to be taking in CO2, giving off oxygen, again, thanks plants, and then not letting too much water out as they do that, right? Because the inside of the leaf is a very tender tissue, they've opened up to be able to take CO2 in, but you don't want to dry out at the same time. Does that make sense? So you have these specialized cells that will allow you to open up, take in CO2, and when it gets really dry or really hot, close up so that you don't dry out. Because again, you're balancing these multiple needs. Letting water out to some degree can be very useful. We call this transpiration because it's like the plant version of sweating. It can help them cool out. Cool off. but you have to have adequate soil moisture for that to be useful. You have to be able to pull water up from your roots, have it leave like you're sweating, and you not dry out in the process, right? If there's not enough soil water, you're gonna dry out. So you're gonna close those stomata because you don't want that, right? You're just trying to live another day when it gets really hot out there. And this can be massive. So a large oak tree can transpire 40,000 gallons per year. Huge amount of water that's just moving up and out through plants. It's actually a major cooling function for urban trees. It's really, really important for our urban trees because they massively cool us not just through shade, but actually through this process. So some of the factors that influence photosynthesis, right? Making sure you got all your energy. Sunlight, obviously. Genetics. Temperature, the optimal range is 65 to 85. Just keep that in your mind, 65 to 85. Where are we most of our summer?
100.
And water. So if it gets too hot or too dry, they're going to shut those stomata and they're not going to be photosynthesizing. They're not going to be producing energy. So they're producing all their energy, and the way they're using it is through a process called respiration. So this is where you're breaking down all those carbohydrates and you're defending yourself. You're making fruit. You're doing all the things that you need sugars for. It occurs in all cells, not just the green ones. So that's one thing. It uses oxygen, and it occurs in light and dark. Right? So think about that. Photosynthesis makes energy. Occurs during the day only. It's only in the green cells. And the optimum range is 65 to 85. This is in contrast to respiration. You're going to use energy, occurs night and day. Right? So you're bringing in energy only during the day, but you're using it all the time. You're bringing in energy only in the green cells, but you're using it in all of them. You're bringing in energy only in 65 to 85 degrees optimally. Respiration gets faster the higher the temperature goes. So by the point where you've closed your stomata because it's too hard out there and you can't photosynthesize at all, your respiration, right, your use of energy is off the chart.
Don't, isn't there, I thought like grasses and stuff can photosynthesize at night.
There are special types of photosynthesis. There's C3, C4, and CAM. There are some plants that have figured out a way to get around this. Most of them have. Yeah. So on warm nights, which is what we have, respiration approaches the rate of photosynthesis. If you were to look at our growing zone, our USDA hardiness zone, we are similar to many parts of Oregon that are basically sod farms and beautiful nurseries. When's the last time you drove past a sod farm here? Right? And it's because even though it's the same like winter temperatures or similar winter temperatures, our nights are so hot and so humid that the plants never get a chance to relax. They never get a chance in the summer. We would ideally want nighttime temperatures 10 to 15 degrees cooler than our daytime temperatures, and we want our daytime temperatures at like 85. This is not our summer, right? And so some plants cannot grow here because they simply are not adapted, and some plants really struggle here. So what happens when all this happens? You get a cash flow problem, right? You don't have enough energy. So you're going to get little to no new growth. They can't store energy for the future. A lot of trees you'll start getting tip dieback. A lot of plants you'll start getting tip dieback because the plants are basically pulling in and doing everything they can to conserve their resources. You're going to get a lot of plants that can't produce fruit anymore. Fruits, seeds, they start aborting. The plant knows that it can't do it, so it just gives up. And so we all, I think, have seen this on our tomatoes, where above certain temperatures, the tomato blossoms just die. You're never going to get fruit there above about 80 degrees, 80, 85 degrees. Pollen typically loses viability above 85 degrees. Plants will even stop forming flower buds, right? Because they just know they can't do anything with it and they're trying to conserve that energy. When you don't have enough energy, you can't invest in defense either, right? So the worst part about that too is when you can't defend yourself and the pests start moving in, many pests release hormones and chemicals that attract other pests, or even can smell your stress, right? So there are a lot of things like aphids that can like smell plant stress, and so they start moving in, right? And the plant's not able to defend because it doesn't have enough for it. And really nothing to give away. So you're just going to not have enough for energy, you're not gonna have enough for defense, you're not gonna have enough for fruit, you're not gonna have enough for anything, so our plants are gonna struggle. And so this is what we have to think about as gardeners, is because what we're dealing with now, and this is where we'll end really quickly, is we are going through climate change. And this is kind of like a bummer note to end on, but we're going through climate change right now pretty profoundly, right? And we're getting hotter, our water is getting more erratic. And that's the thing, is that low water is hard on a plant, heat is hard on a lot of plants. Low water and heat together, very hard on a lot of plants. And so in areas of North Carolina like here, we're actually getting a similar amount of water we used to in the past, but we're getting it much more sporadically and it's much droughtier. So a lot of plants struggle. And so we're gonna have to really think about how we're doing our planting and also just be realistic with ourselves that like, there's a month in the summer where even though it seems like it's summer and so like your warm season veggies should be able to grow, they kind of shut down. They slow down their growth, they don't produce fruit well, and it's because they're really struggling with how do I stay alive if I have to have my stomata closed and I can't photosynthesize, right? How do I stay alive without drying out? And so they kind of just hold for a while. And so it's just something that, all of this is to say, guys, it's not you. It's the plants, and they're doing their best, but it's hard out there, and our hot, humid summer nights are really our killers, right? Because they don't even get a chance to rest. Yeah.
So you said our hardiness zone is set by the cold temperatures, not by our summers. Is there another metric that measures?
There are other metrics that people have tried to adopt for that, but none are as commonly used as hardiness zone. And so that's why I often will say to someone, like, I don't care if that's a zone 8, if I can look at the plant and just say, like, nah, it's not gonna work here, or it's gonna struggle in the winter. And a lot of times that's about, like, what can it handle heat-wise, not cold-wise.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if heat is as much of a problem as lack of water, does adding irrigation really do much to support the plant?
It can buy you time, but in those high heat environments, the plant is struggling, and adding irrigation will buy you time, but it will also typically create a humidity and moisture problem that is, I would be concerned now about diseases coming in, because like, I think it can buy you time, but like it's not a long-term solution, if that makes sense. Yeah.
What if you added like bacteria and fungi to the soil to assist with the feeding process? Or if you add like fertilized in a specific way, could you shift temporarily the cash flow problem?
Typically no, and this is crazy because if you think about like, when it gets really hot like that, you actually kind of want your plant to shut down. Because if it can just stop growing and hold, that is much better than encouraging any growth. Because encouraging growth necessarily requires the sugars more than the nutrients. And you're trying to get it to just like hunker down for a minute, you know what I mean? Yeah, just survive. Yeah. Last
So,
one that we take away.
just to make sure I'm understanding, so if we may have hotter daytime temperatures and they stress, but they have ways of dealing with that. It's sometimes it's the warmer evening temperature with that. If the evening temperatures were cooler than what they would be, they'd have a greater success.
Yeah, so if I had my druthers, I wouldn't have the hot day or the hot night. But if I could pick, even not having the hot night would really help. Because the plants just never have time to slow their metabolism to get it to balance with photosynthesis, right? Hot night means you're charging hard all the time. Hot day means you're having trouble producing energy. And having trouble producing energy but only kind of charging would be doable, but charging all the time and not producing energy, you just can't make the balance work.
Can watering schedule help with that?
Yeah, but again, it creates that humidity and moisture problem that can lead to disease. So, all right, so with that, happy note. You guys are doing great. We're going to take like a 15-minute break if that's okay. We got snacks.